I want to talk about specifically 5 points in this introduction, 5 angles to look at efficiency. The first one on funding, the second one on institutional autonomy, the third one on strategic governance, the fourth one I would like to talk a little bit about mergers, collaboration, partnerships. As we understand, this is a very important topic in Lithuania, and the last one about leadership and management. What we found in our project so far are those 5 important elements to look at the topic. I will take examples and data and experiences from several of our work, and particularly from our University Autonomy Scorecard. Is data that we have from nearly 30 higher education systems on the status of autonomy, also from our Public Funding Observatory, where we monitor funding since 2008 in 30 systems, from our DEFINE project, where we looked at efficiency also from a system level, and then we looked specifically at mergers and concentration processes. So there I will bring some examples as well. So you also obviously have then the slides and the links if you're interested in more details on these topics. I've already mentioned the USTREAM project itself is a European-funded project which we run with several partners, and it's in the framework of our work on funding and governance that we do at EUA. I already mentioned as well the rationale, why we started this project, and here you just have for the background information, some information on activities that we do. Now, when you talk about efficiency across Europe, the first thing that we noticed in the first activities of the project is that everyone has a very different understanding what efficiency means. We've asked about 70 institutions that took part in our survey what they understand when someone talks about efficiency, and you can see this word cloud has many different ideas. Obviously very strong comes out, you have the word resources in it, so it's of course very strongly connected to the use of resources, but you also see processes, you also have strategy in there, you have management, leadership in there. So you can see the topic of efficiency has very many connections when you talk about that. So this is also something we're trying to do with this project to show that you can look at the topic at very different angles. And from our side, it's not efficiency in the narrow sense, just looking at the input side of the resources, but also looking at the aims, so moving already towards effectiveness. What are you achieving with the use of resources? And in the long run, we've seen this also in several systems, and particularly in the UK, where the whole discussion moves to a dynamic of talking more about value for money. So it's not about that you're using, of course it's important to use the resources in the right way, but also what is actually the output, what provide universities for society, for the economy, for the future of our societies, and there it's very important to make this link. We look in the project on several levels. So we look at system level, what's happening in system level in different countries, what's happening at sector level, because many systems is also that the university sector as a whole is working on that topic, and also what's happening at institutional level. The other elements we try to structure a little bit the different dimensions, so you can look at efficiency in operational areas. So this is the whole question, for example, of how you use your infrastructure, of how you use your resources. And my colleague Veronica will show you several examples of that. element. Then you can look at efficiency in academic matters, and then a third one is through strategic governance. Obviously, there's very often an overlap of these three elements, but just to give you an idea of what we're trying to look at here. Now, here you see also from our survey, we asked what are the key drivers for efficiency. And on the left side, you see the top three drivers. The first one is budget cuts or decreasing resources. So that is an external pressure that drive institutions to look at efficiency. So not necessarily a positive driver, but then the next ones are already new institutional approaches and institutional changes. So here a very strong internal motivation, which shows again universities have on the one hand the pressure from outside to look at the topic, but also the need from inside when it is about change to look at efficiency and effectiveness. On the right side, you see we also asked what are the key enablers to implement efficiency, and on the very top is the commitment of the institutional leadership. And that is very clear from all the examples that we've seen in this project. This is not a technical issue. It's not a technical issue. It's really a leadership issue for the vision to implement efficiency and effectiveness. The second one is institutional autonomy. I will talk a little bit more detail about that. So also very clear this plays an important role. And the third one is the inclusiveness of all relevant actors within the institution. So it shows again, in order to successfully implement it, this is not something that can be done exclusively top-down, but it needs the participation of everyone. So you see a little bit already from these aspects, we can see that funding, autonomy, governance, leadership are key factors to have a successful efficiency and effectiveness strategy. Going now to the first part, efficiency and funding. Here you can also see the data from our Public Funding Observatory in Lithuania, so you know that yourself very well. Obviously with a very difficult situation in funding, and you see here the decline in 2000, particularly in 2010, and I will show you then how this is set in a European comparative. But obviously, what we found as well, it is extremely difficult to implement efficiency and effectiveness in the long term in a situation of underfunding. Now, this is obviously a sort of contradiction because it is a very strong driver if you have reduced resources, but many long-term efficiency and effectiveness action also require, in the first place, sometimes investment. So we've also seen that additional funding can lead to better delivery of reforms. And we also need to differentiate between short-term and long-term efficiency goals. So while in a setting of a crisis of funding cuts, of course what's addressed in the first place are short-term efficiency gains, mostly looking at, okay, how can you use reduced resources, where can you make efficiency gains in the short term, but the long-term efficiency gains are very often done best in a setting of solid funding. We also need to look at the overall situation on efficiency in combination with other factors, so for example student numbers, and here again data from our Public Funding Observatory, where you see systems in relation to their funding. So has it decreased over the period 2008 to 2016 in relation to the development of student numbers? And here you can see, well, Lithuania is, as you know, in the situation of decreasing funding, but at the same time also with decreasing student numbers. So this is also an important factor to consider when talking about efficiency and effectiveness. Second point I want to talk about, efficiency and autonomy. Here you see the 4 dimensions of our work on autonomy: organizational, financial, staffing, and academic autonomy. You see all the different indicators that we use and how autonomy links to efficiency. So when you look at the organizational autonomy, what's important here is to really achieve efficiency and strategic governance. It also links to shared services, to collaboration. So here, the whole question how you're organized, how your governing bodies work together, that's a very crucial role in implementation. In the area of financial autonomy, that very strongly links, of course, to the use of your facilities when we're talking about space optimization, strategic financial management, but also in terms of collaborative procurement. Here, the capacity to act is very important, how institutions can actually achieve efficiencies. The link with staffing autonomy is evident, I would say, with all the aspects on how institutions can recruit the human resources, both in the academic and research area, but also in the administrative area, because you will need the relevant skills to implement efficiency and effectiveness. So here, very strong link. And of course, in the last dimension, academic autonomy, the whole question if institutions can adapt their academic offer, if they can use, for example, learning analytics. So we will have examples on that one as well. So here, if you do not have the relevant degree of autonomy, it's going to be very difficult for institutions to make progress in this matter. So this shows how the frameworks are very important for institutions to deliver efficiency and effectiveness. Now, here the data from Autonomy Scorecard on Lithuania, where you can see Lithuania is actually in 2 of the dimensions in a very high category, also moved up with the reforms that have been taking place in the last year, so in organizational and financial autonomy, with the indicators that we used quite high. In staffing autonomy, it's more in the middle, and a rather lower level in academic autonomy. But of course, you also need to link this to the funding situation. So, for example, financial autonomy, even if it's high, if the funding situation is critical, then you can't reap the benefits of this financial autonomy. Now, how this more formal autonomy is implemented in reality is again a second element. So I'm sure this is also a topic for several discussions. But let me move now to strategic governance, the next level. Here we can differentiate 2 elements. The one is efficient and effective governance at system level, so looking at the relationship between public authorities and the different actors and the institutions, and the right regulatory framework. So that is already one key success factor. But at the second level, looking at the institutional level, here it's also important to have the right internal governance model. So it's about finding the right balance between inclusion of the different actors within the university community and an efficient decision-making structure. And this is something we've seen in all of our projects over the last years, that this is one of the core and key questions in many university systems. The data from our last Autonomy Scorecard shows that within the last 5 years, 12 out of the 29 systems that we looked at had undergone governance reforms within their systems. And the need to find an efficient governance systems is very often behind that. Very often heated discussions about the structure of governing bodies, who is included in these governing bodies, how, for example, external members come into the question, who is electing them, who's selecting them. So those are all all questions that are debated in many, many systems. I've mentioned here just a few systems so that you can see this is going through all areas within Europe. Well, I've got numerous examples of where we've been already this year, where we have precisely discussed this topic. So what are the key questions here? The key question is are the different bodies working together in an efficient way? So it's also about the clarity of the competencies, which is on the one hand evident, but we've seen many, many systems where it's not always 100% clear who is responsible in the end, in the detail, for doing what. So clear competencies of the different governing bodies is important, and which responsibilities do they have? So we're moving in Europe more to tending that you have rather smaller board-type bodies with a smaller number of decision makers, very often with external members who are responsible for the long-term strategic decision-making, whereas the senates are then more for the core decision-makings for academic matters. But of course, the way how these two bodies work together is crucial in implementing efficiency. So here around governance, many important questions about how these are composed. And then, of course, it's also about the role of these governing bodies within the efficiency and effectiveness agenda. And we've seen in systems that had already for a while been looking at this topic, you can see that also the members of these governing bodies are very important in contributing to this efficiency culture within the institutions. Because it's this implementing efficiency and effectiveness in most cases has something to do with change, and that requires a very strong collaboration between the leadership and the different governing bodies, and how this is also implemented within the institution. The fourth point I want to look at is on the questions that we have discussed with the National Rectors Conference. We will look at a little bit is the question of collaboration and mergers. And this is also a topic we're looking at USTREAM, at the different forms of how institutions can work together. And this is just to show you the enormous width of possibilities of collaboration. And on the one hand, a merger is sort of the most intense form of collaboration, of bringing institutions together under one legal structure, is only one possibility. We've seen other forms, federations, alliances, clustering, strategic partnerships, developing joint institutes, developing consortia for very specific elements or networks. So you see there's a whole variety of different elements, and our two examples from other systems will address those different forms. So we will have one example of a merger from Ireland, and on the other hand we have a system in Austria with the region of Styria, where you have more on the other end of partnerships, many interesting examples. Now this is just to show you a little bit the differentiation. So a merger is the strongest form of collaboration, where different institutions come together under one new legal entity. So this is obviously the most complex form. There are other ways, creating federations. This is something that's happening in France, where institutions form together a federation, and they share resources, they share also governing bodies together, but they keep the legal entities on their own. Then you also have a form of clustering. This is something we've seen in Flanders, where you have different types of institutions being brought together. So this is also very often done by a system-wide approach. then you have the other forms of joint collaborations. You can have joint institutes, joint programs, purchasing consortia together. And then we have alliances. Alliances on the one hand at national level, but very often and strongly increasing across Europe at international level. So the whole discussion about European universities, which has been triggered within this last half year at European level, shows that there is a strong push towards collaboration and alliances in a very strategic way. So not strategic partnerships, not with many institutions, but rather focused with institutions with a joint strategy. Now, when looking at mergers, you can look at very different types. I don't want to go into too much detail, but just two elements I want to highlight from here. You can look at merging different types of institutions, so that where we have a complementarity. And we also see mergers of where you merge the same type of institutions. That can be sometimes quite challenging, of course, because you have to find a way of make this efficient in a way. Now, why are we looking also at these form within our project? Because there are lots of expectations from mergers and corporations. In our work on mergers, we've seen particularly one driver is to have an enhanced national and international profile of very often a stronger institution. One of the other expectations is that this provides more opportunities for teaching and research cooperation. Sometimes we've also seen that having a stronger institution, having a stronger, let's say, negotiation position via public authorities, and of course the very strong link to expectations of economies of scale and higher efficiency. So this can lead to more public funding, a better off academic course offer, higher research income, and of course staffing efficiencies in the long run. So those are many of these expectations. What we have seen though is that they're not necessarily always achieved, and there are, in those cases where they are achieved, you can see there are certain success factors or conditions that are very important to get there. Now, what I wanted to address here as well is when you do a cost-benefit analysis of mergers, we've seen that this is very difficult to calculate because mergers can have very variety of different effects. The time scale is very complex because the time from when you start looking at merging, integrating institutions is not 100% defined. So very often it starts from either negotiations among the leadership or from incentives by government. So you have a very long time scale till you start concretely with making plans, strategies, and until then there is the official merger, but then afterwards it takes an enormous time to implement. So the time scale can be very long. Very often there are unexpected challenges. In most cases the challenges have been underestimated. And sometimes it's also very difficult to associate the concrete costs to mergers. So very often you would have to change, let's say, just the IT infrastructure of an institution. Okay, this can be related to the merger, but this can be also related to general development in university management. And of course, what's one of the key factors is that mergers are usually the core load of the implementation is that done by the staff within the institution, who usually has a different job to do, to teach and undertake research, and they have to take, in most cases, this job, even if there is external support and external advice. It's mostly done by the people, and that is, of course, something which makes it very challenging. Now, what are the success factors that we have come across in our work? It's first of all the reason why one should merge should never be purely economic. It's the academic vision that's the key factor, and that makes it a success. Second element is before launching into merger, alternative options should be explored. And we will talk about some of them during today, and this is and only then, if you have explored alternative options and come to the conclusion that, well, actually merger is the right thing to do, then you can go in there. Of course, there are many aspects of success. I don't want to go into too much detail here because we don't have the time, but we will have examples as well from a concrete merger, and leadership is a very important part, and having the right governance model in place as well. Of course, mergers can also be supported by policymakers. First of all, of being aware that this is a complex process. When providing incentives or pushes towards mergers, this needs to be understood also by policymakers that this is a complex activity. The last point I want to make before I conclude is the importance of leadership and management for efficiency, and of course also for this very specific topic of mergers, but more globally as well. We've seen that the most successful implementation of efficiency is that the leadership is behind, but not only the top leadership. Of course, they need to provide a clear vision. They need to sort of communicate internally, externally to make the case why this is important, why this actually enhances the core mission of the institution in teaching and research. It also needs to go throughout the institution because it can't be done only by the leadership. The institution needs in all areas, in the institutes, in the departments, faculties, change leaders who can take this further. And we're seeing in many systems that are really addressing this. So I just wanted to show you two examples. You find many more, but for example, in the UK, there is a Leadership Foundation for Higher Education, an organization that provides specific training, leadership training, management training for higher education leaders. They have also different programs. So it's the top leadership program for the top leadership, but also for mid-level managers to get the necessary skills to lead and manage within a higher education institution. You also have university networks who look at that very strongly. Just one example, the U4 network for universities that also have designed for the membership a specific academic leadership program, and you find multiple other ones. So this is something we recommend to look at when talking on this topic. Last point, we also would like to make sort of a little bit of a marketing for how we continue with this project. The next big event will be the EUA Funding Forum, which will take place in Barcelona, 18th and 19th of October, where we will explore many more of these topics of efficiency, effectiveness on those 2 days in Barcelona. We will also discuss funding reforms. So as you are also discussing funding reforms, I think this would be a highly useful event to share experiences also from within policymakers, institutional leaders. So looking forward to hopefully see many of you there as well. Well, I think we have a couple of minutes for discussion before I hand over to my colleague Veronica to give some concrete examples.
Thank you, Thomas, for sharing your ideas. And as I understand, funding, autonomy, leadership, and governance is key factors, yes? Yeah. So anyway, thank you for keeping time, and maybe some of you would like to reflect or just to ask something. Take your chance.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. And that would be 15 months before starting our reforms. We probably would be able to use more of your advices. But my specific question is, you have mentioned the cost-benefit analysis, and you said that it's not easy to allocate clearly the costs and benefits. And I'm having in mind just technical issue that if there is no investment into the project, merger project, the formula doesn't calculate IRR, internal rate of return, or net present value technically. So it means that investment should be there for the project to have negative cash flow. Are you having in mind that?
Yeah, thank you very much. But I would say it's never too late to use the experiences as well. The reason why I addressed is the difficulty of the cost-benefit analysis is, first of all, we haven't seen any examples when you've gone through the whole process of a merger that you undo it. So therefore, it's also afterwards, it's rarely done to look at the cost-benefit analysis. Mostly evaluations of mergers afterwards look if they have achieved, let's say, the academic aims, the vision that has been set out. And the second part is that, of course, you can calculate some elements of saying, okay, what has been the investment, be it support from public authorities, or you have some calculations, but usually the real costs are by far underestimated. So very often you don't take account of the input that the whole academic community, the governance of the institutions need to invest in the whole project. And it takes away, of course, resources from other activities. So how is the impact on those researchers, academic staff that's involved, that has to reduce the research activity of getting the merger through there. And there are many, many costs that you can't 100% attribute to being 100% triggered by the merger. So investing in new infrastructure, investing in new ICT tools, well, it might have been triggered by the merger, but it might have been an appropriate investment in any case. So that's why our recommendations are, because not only because of that, it's difficult to have the economic argument. It should not be the primary driver for a merger, but much more focus on what is the academic vision, what is the added value for the teaching mission of the institution, for the research mission of the institution, for society. Also not always easy to identify, but this is the core, I would say.
Any other questions? Okay, just Kęstutis Krikščiūnas.
Thank you for your nice presentation, very clear and effective presentation. My question is about Macron initiative, 20 university networks. Mm-hmm. Can you comment this initiative in the context of effectiveness and efficiency?
So you're talking about the European Universities Initiative. Maybe to explain what this is. This has been triggered by a speech by President Macron at the Sorbonne autumn last year, where he proposed that in order to bring the European higher education area further along and make it internationally competitive, we need to create networks of European universities. Now, this has moved the topic of universities and research onto the top agenda of, let's say, the top governance of different countries, which is the new thing, because as you all know, I mean, we have been talking about networking and cooperation is the daily bread and butter of universities, but it's not always on the top agenda of our prime ministers in the different systems, and that has moved the discussion to the top. So it has also been arrived on the European top agenda. So before the commissioner before you didn't hear the word universities very often. Then it has been discussed also at that level. And now into the next funding programs, there are funding incentives included that you have support for European universities that form networks. Now, the criteria, they still need to, well, they are being discussed, but they still need to be decided. But what's emerging here is that this is going to be a rather exclusive funding incentive. So that means there will only be a few networks that get funding. And it looks like as if the criteria that as a network you will need to address both the teaching mission, both the mobility exchange, as well as cooperation in research and innovation, as well as in the support function. So those networks who can demonstrate how they work together in the best way to address all of these issues, those are the ones who might likely get the funding. And what we can see is there are already several networks across Europe that think that they might be in the position to receive the funding. And I think it's not so much that there will be an enormous amount of money for these networks in the future, but it's more about, let's say, the label that it will create, that you are part of a rather exclusive network. What it does in any case is it provides a push towards having a much more focused, a much more strategic approach to partnerships among the different institutions. So if you look at it also in the past, very often the strategy was to have many partnerships worldwide. And the trend is to rather really look through those partnerships and show where are the ones that make sense, where do we have common grounds to work much stronger together with a selected group of institutions, and having a stronger focus on that. So that's a little bit what's happening on that front.